An entity, call him Maxwell's demon, sitting between the two gases, taking only the coldest molecules of gas from the hot side and putting them on the cold side, and vice versa. So the hot gas got hotter and the cold gas colder. More order, but breaking the law of thermodynamics. Well, if your antagonist is Maxwell's demon, and he's supposed to create order, he's obviously gone crazy. When Napoleon invaded Egypt in the early 19th century, he put together a team of scientists to choose exactly which bits to loot. One of these scientists, called Fourier, missed Egyptian weather so much when he got home, he became the expert on heat. How did heat flow, for instance? How did things warm up? And when things cooled down, where did heat go? Well, by 1851, people knew that heat was made by moving molecules. And in Scotland, a fellow called Kelvin decided to take a look at the cooling down process. According to Kelvin, the coolest anything could ever get, on a temperature scale he invented called the Kelvin scale, would be when it got so cold, all its molecules stopped moving. That, Kelvin reckoned, would be at minus 273 degrees Celsius. So he made that 0 on his scale. The coldest there is, 0 degrees Kelvin. Basically, Kelvin wrote the second law of thermodynamics, according to which anything left alone with no further heat input goes cold and stays cold.
Not yet.
Good dear. And here it is, my nice hot pie.
Universal harmony was sought with mathematical precision by the Renaissance Florentine architect Alberti. You remember Alberti? He inspired Vigenère to write code. Mathematics is a connection here to the thermometer via the mathematician Fourier's interest in heat.
These darn coded doors. I'm gonna be late for work, and I've forgotten the code, and you know what that means. I can't remember the last two glyphs. I know they're on this wall somewhere. These darn coded doors. You're trying to get back at me for not letting you by. That's one. Just one more. Are you trying to get me? You place a very low value on human life. You're trying to get back. Are you trying to get me killed? That's one. You place a... Hallelujah! Hey, thanks for the help.
A Venetian artist called Piranesi inspired the neoclassical craze for things ancient Greek and Roman. By 1760, if you were a socially upwardly mobile Brit, Greek or Roman design was the only stuff worth having. If you didn't get the latest classical Josiah Wedgwood plaster mouldings, or Robert Adams ceilings, or pillars, or porticos, or some imitation Roman furniture for your stately home, well, sorry, it just wasn't stately. But in among all this Greek and Roman decoration, all over Adams' ceilings, walls, fireplaces, and anywhere else he could put it, was something else he copied from Piranesi. Something else Piranesi had seen in Rome. Egyptian symbols. The whole Egypto-craze thing got a real leg up when Napoleon decided to invade Egypt, and, by the way, remove large lumps of it. Napoleon's staff mathematician Fourier is the connection to the thermometer. A Venetian artist called Piranesi inspired... early steamships used up too much coal, so by 1900 they had developed turbine engines that produced steam from boilers to spin a drive shaft so fast it had to be geared down to turn the ship's propellers. By 1927 you could move a 55,000-ton ship, and first-class travel offered plumbing and electric light to Americans going as tourists to Europe with an apparently insatiable appetite for transatlantic travel. The era of the luxury liner began. Many of the passengers were wealthy enough to afford ship-to-shore radio telephone calls at $1,000 a minute. That connects to the cellular phone. And since the impetus to improve the steamships came from grain shipments after the Civil War, the ship connects to the Confederate Army's code.
Pharaoh forgot his warship and wishes for you to fetch it for him.
By the 18th century, Delft had pretty much cornered the whole European pottery market. Some of the Delft fakes were so valuable that if you dropped a bit, you had it very expensively repaired. Which is how an English potter called Wedgwood got his start in life, until he'd made enough money from repairing Delftware to set up on his own. And when he did, his stuff looked like this. Queensware, he called it. He had an eye for publicity, so in 1765 he sent a tea set to the royal family. They liked it. So all his ads said, "If the Queen uses it, so should you." Made him rich, that trick. But compared with the Delft, look how different the Wedgwood style is. Simple. This, and the more expensive stuff he turned out, was about as far from Chinese as you can get. You were supposed to say Wedgwood's work reminded you of the elegance of ancient Greece or Rome, because by this time everybody'd gone right off things Chinese and were deeply into a new fashion craze called neoclassical. Some of the best vases in 17th century England were made by Josiah Wedgwood, who got his start repairing imitation Chinese porcelain known as Delftware. Delftware connects back to the teacup, and Wedgwood's interest in Egyptian designs connects to the hieroglyph. So, hieroglyph links to thermometer, to mathematical symbol, to code, to ship, to cellular telephone, radio static, strange noises from outer space, and the Big Bang, the secret of the universe. Not bad for Zen Buddhist tea drinkers and Florentine numbers freaks, eh? Which leaves only one question. What is the sound of one hand clapping?
Not yet. Welcome, wanderer. You've done the impossible. As the web has eroded into chaos, you've restored it at every turn. Congratulations. It's such a pity that you've come so far, only to fail now.
Not so fast, Chaos. We're not through with you yet. Here, take this. I've always wanted to do this. Well done. The web is restored. People's appreciation and understanding of the interconnectedness of history and invention and ideas is safe now, thanks to you. Oh, and here's a little souvenir for you. Take care. Back around 1750, here on the lonely windswept cliffs of Cornwall in the far west of England, tin miners are busy tunnelling their way out under the sea. The mines are leaking salt water and the pumps don't work. Look, you've got a boiler, a piston and a beam. Coal heats a boiler full of water to make steam. Here's the piston cylinder. The steam comes in here, pushes the piston up, tilts this beam. The other end has a chain working a suction pump. Now when the piston's all the way up, pipe ice-cold water onto the cylinder. It chills down fast, so the steam inside condenses. So a vacuum forms. So the pressure of the air outside the cylinder can push the piston down. That tilts the beam the other way, pulls up the pump chain, and so on. Except, every time you chill the cylinder, it gets that bit cooler. So next time, the steam coming in condenses early. So the vacuum forms halfway through the stroke. And this goes on happening until the whole thing eventually grinds to a halt. Our hero, James Watt, realizes that the problem is the chilly cylinder and its premature condensation. So he links it to a separate condensing cylinder submerged in ice water. So now the steam rushes in, pushes up the piston, open a valve, and the steam rushes out into the condensing cylinder and condenses. Vacuum forms everywhere and the main piston comes down. That's it. The main cylinder's hot all the time, the condensing cylinder's cold all the time. You've got yourself a steam pump that works. It was the inventor James Watt who came up with what came before carbon paper. Do your writing or drawing with a wet mix of ink and gum, press on damp paper, and that's it. You can make copies until your ink and gum dry out. And the reason I'm here in an Italian graveyard is because by the early 19th century, no office was complete without an advanced version of Watt's copier. And then, in 1823, Cyrus P. Dawkin of Concord, Massachusetts, found an even better way. This. No, not the lamp. This. Carbon black. And this, paraffin oil. You chill paraffin oil right down, and you get paraffin wax. Mix the paraffin wax with the carbon black and spread the resulting gunk on the back of a page, and what you get is carbon paper. Look closely at this incandescent event. See that stuff melting just below the match head, making the wood catch on fire? Paraffin wax. That's there because the match wouldn't work without it. As the phosphorus head ignited, you'd get flare, but you wouldn't get any flame. That's what two Swedish brothers called Lindström did in 1851. Put the new paraffin wax together with phosphorus and invented the match. You know electric current alternates positive-negative? In 1896, a would-be electronics type called Brown runs this into an electromagnet, making its magnetic field change. Now he shoots a stream of electrons in a cathode ray tube into the changing magnetic field, and it deflects the electron stream up and down. And there, when the electrons hit a screen treated with phosphorus, is a visible picture of what the current is doing. Brown has invented a gizmo for seeing electricity, the oscilloscope. The same technique that works inside an oscilloscope builds up a picture on your TV screen. See? Which is why in July 1969, most of the people on Earth saw this happening.
Ignition sequence start.
They watched a rocket built of high-tech alloys and space-age technology lift off for the moon. Watch this. The greatest sword blades in history have always been made of the steel invented in medieval Damascus, alloy steel. The one thing you need when you're changing the shape of the world is hard metal to cut with, and even harder stuff to cut the hard metal. Which is why back in the late 19th century, a fellow called Mushet did what the Damascus sword makers had done centuries before. He threw some tungsten into molten steel and got the first new steel alloy that was just what everybody had been waiting for. A girl's best friend. Trouble is, they cost an arm and a leg. So an American called Atchison started fooling around with an electric furnace trying to make artificial diamonds, a substance that would be harder than the hardest steel alloy. He heats carbon black up to 11 million degrees, and out comes carborundum, which isn't diamonds, but will cut like diamond. Then Atchison heats up carborundum, and out comes graphite, as in pencil lead. In 1912, somebody took a graphite crystal and aimed one of the new X-rays at it. A few years earlier, a French geologist had dropped a crystal he was examining and noticed that it split neatly. And the more he split it, the more it split neatly. And all crystals did the same. So if crystals had such incredibly regular shapes, then their atoms had to be in incredibly regular patterns. The ones in graphite, made incidentally by heating carborundum, are particularly nicely spaced. And sure enough, the X-rays hit the rows of crystal atoms, bounced off, and started to make a pattern of light and dark, just as you'd expect if X-rays behaved like light waves, boosting or cancelling each other as they interfered. It turned out that different materials make different diffraction patterns, and that tells you what the material is. The pattern you're about to see is the most exciting one ever found. This pattern bounced off atoms arranged in a formation known as a double helix. This is the pattern of the molecule of life, DNA. In 1783, the Montgolfier brothers of France stunned the world with the first manned flight. Went 7 miles at 3,000 feet. By 1800, balloons were the space shuttle of the day. One day in 1795, one of the Montgolfier brothers of France had a great idea for upgrading the royal amusements, which, amazing as it seems, you're looking at. The Versailles Water Gardens. Hydraulic engineering back then being the last word in gee-whizzery. Now, you're not going to believe this, but back then the way aristocrats had fun was by squirting water about. So Montgolfier's idea fitted right in. Worked just like this toy. You compress air so that it builds up behind a water reservoir, and then when you release the water, this happens. In 1857, things started getting boring indeed, with a tunnel through the Alps. It was a boring business, boring. First you made the holes for the explosives, then you stood around while they blew that bit up, which was why they cut only 9 inches of tunnel a day. Then they brought in a variant of Joseph Montgolfier's hydraulic ram to compress air for pneumatic drills. Remember Montgolfier, the balloonist? That's the connection. Anyway, bingo, 15 feet a day. And then, of course, cutting through mountains became even more fun when somebody invented dynamite. Thanks to the invention of dynamite, there were 3 tunnels under the Alps by the turn of the century, and a new luxury way to get to Istanbul, on the Orient Express. Now, by an extraordinary irony, the 3 chief engineers building all 3 tunnels died of heart attacks. The irony being that the nitroglycerin they were using could have saved them. See, before dynamite, the main use for nitroglycerin was as medication to relieve the symptoms of a heart condition, because in one form, nitroglycerin opens up the constricted blood vessels that can lead to a heart attack. There was one other less drastic medical use for nitro. It was discovered that handling dynamite every day could give you what was understatedly known by doctors at the time as a dynamite headache, relieved by taking nitroglycerin. Until, that is, things took a turn for the botanical. This little plant's called meadowsweet. And back in 1835, a French chemist had extracted some stuff from it called acetyl salicylic acid. Found out it would cure headaches. But the process took so long he gave up. Anyway, the botanical name for meadowsweets, Spirea ulmaria. Now, a few years later, when every German chemist was going nuts trying to extract anything they could find from the new Wundergunk throwaway byproduct of gaslight, coal tar, one of them came across a chemical called phenol with which you could artificially make acetyl salicylic acid quick and fast. So he made up a name for it. A for acetyl salicylic acid, S-P-I-R from the botanical name for meadowsweet, and nobody knows why he chose the last 2 letters, I-N. And that's why aspirin's called aspirin. In 1867, a surgeon called Lister heard somebody tried carbonic acid to disinfect cows. So he tried the stuff, its other name was phenol, on his patients, and it worked. Then, one night at a dance, some woman splashed perfume on this guy, name of Richardson, an anaesthetist. And he noticed the cooling effect as it evaporated, remembered ether evaporated, and raced home to invent the ether anesthetic spray. In 1893, a German engineer named Maybach came up with an automotive application of the atomizer spray. The carburetor basically jets a fine mist of air and gasoline into the cylinder, where a spark plug explodes the mixture, and the explosion drives the cylinder piston up and down. This up and down is converted to round and round, thus moving the car wheels. In today's automobiles, the fuel mixture is often computer-controlled. In a way, the computer got its start with cashmere shawls. In 1890, a young engineer called Herman Hollerith happened to be working on the US Census, and he was desperate for an automated way to count people. Now, his brother-in-law happened to be in textiles, and he told him about a new loom going around that would do cashmere shawl patterns automatically. It worked a bit like this. You take a piece of paper and put a pattern of holes in it, a bit like this pianola roll. Okay, you set up a bunch of wire hooks on springs, and you push the whole lot against the paper. Where there's a hole, a hook goes through and hooks up a particular thread. The particular thread you want for that particular part of the pattern. All of which makes weaving even the most complex stuff like this a piece of cake. Hollerith reused the idea of holes in paper to represent every kind of census data the government wanted. He did it so successfully, he went on to set up a business that later changed its name to IBM. In the 1920s, a fellow named James Powers designed a machine that would use the holes punched in paper cards to represent numbers. Look, 45 columns, each with positions for 10 holes, 0 to 9. You punch the data into the cards, then you put them into a machine that would sort them in any order you wanted at up to 15,000 an hour and tell you how many you had of a particular hole. So it was perfect for statistics, records, stock control. Bookkeeping was never going to need books again. I wonder if the design of those keys she's punching might remind you of something else you find in an office. Like a typewriter? That's why in 1927, Powers took his idea to the Rand Company, the biggest office equipment outfit in America, selling over 4,000 office products from card indexes to typewriters. They bought a company that made typewriters. The typewriter had been invented in 1867 by a fellow called Scholes, who'd based it on the idea of piano keys. I don't suppose there's ever been an individual quite like the one we call Renaissance man. You know, those people who once knew everything there was to know about everything. Like this guy, George Bower. George Bower was really quite a guy. He taught Greek, then Latin, then grammar. Then he went into physics, then chemistry, then linguistics, and then publishing. And then, in the middle of the 16th century, he came here, to northern Italy, to the best university in Europe, because he'd finally decided what he really wanted to be. A doctor. Anyway, George finishes the course and in time goes off to become a GP in a mining town in what would now be the Czech Republic, where he promptly writes a multi-volume reference book. But not about medicine, about mining, of course. After all, George is a unique Renaissance man, so mining is just another string to his bow. Now, I don't suppose copper's ever been quite so popular as it was during Renaissance times, although even today it's valuable enough that pennies aren't made of copper anymore. In Bower's day, it was such priceless stuff that if you owned a mine of it and used the techniques in his book, you'd know in advance that things financial were going to go with a bang. Copper, that's one connection here, was so valuable in Renaissance times because it helped to make the equivalent of the gift for the man who has everything. A bronze cannon. Because what you had to have in the 16th century was firepower. Now, the only fly in the ointment for cannon-firing princes and such was that fighting battles back then wasn't like it is today. There was no such thing as a regular army, which gave them a particularly inconvenient problem. They couldn't get hold of money when they needed it, to pay their mercenary troops when they wanted it, which was always yesterday, because there were no banks. Well, not banks we'd call banks. And nobody ever burnt the financial candle at both ends, quite like the father of this chap, Philip II of Spain. Philip's father had left him with the royal crest, the royal crown, and a royal financial pain. Phil, a chip off the old block, tried solving the problem in the traditional manner by invading someone. In 1588, Philip made his play, which was to head up the English Channel with an invasion fleet called, for psychological warfare reasons, the Armada, meaning tons of guns. And that's the connection to the lawn bowling ball through Sir Francis Drake, who beat the Armada. When the Spanish Armada set out to invade England in 1588, King Philip's grand plan was to wipe out the English navy, take over a fast-growing economy, and get some money. As the shock news of the approaching Spanish mega fleet reached the English Naval High Command, they were out having a game of bowls. So, like any Englishman would in moments of impending disaster, they went on with their game, of course. Because thanks to Queen Elizabeth, they had new, high-tech, high-speed ships able to run circles around the Spanish, which they did, and won. Cheers. But the Armada had given the English a kind of scare you don't forget. So by the mid-17th century, they, and then everybody else, were into building really big ships. I mean, one of those monsters took 1,000 oak trees. Well, that put the kibosh on people making glass, because they'd been chopping down all the wood to make charcoal for fuel for their glass furnaces. By the late 17th century, there were new housing starts all over Europe. But the particular one we're looking at right now was just the biggest one of all. The Palace of Versailles outside Paris. A glassmaker's dream. I mean, look at all those windows. Anyway, after windows, plate glass got used for the one thing that makes any room bigger and brighter. Not surprisingly, in a world filled with candles, it got used for mirrors. Glassmaking connects to the superstar lawn bowler Sir Francis Drake, because all those wooden ships, to defend against future armadas, needed the trees glassmakers had previously used for their charcoal fuel. And it connects to James Hadley, who used the better mirror to invent an important nautical instrument. In 1730, an Englishman named James Hadley put two new precision mirrors on a navigational instrument he invented called a sextant. Line up the horizon through the telescope on the half-silvered mirror. With the top mirror, move the image of a star so it's superimposed on the horizon in the half-silvered mirror. Read the angle off the bottom scale. Then do the same again with another star. Then your star tables will tell you where on Earth you would have to be to get those two stars at those two angles. So now you know where your ship is. Thanks to the sextant and a surveying principle called triangulation, you could now measure horizontal distances with great precision, which left only one problem: heights. There still weren't any on maps yet. So the connection here is to Saussure, the Swiss fossil finder, who was so preoccupied with the height of Mont Blanc. In 1787, a Swiss named Saussure became so obsessed with Mont Blanc that he climbed it with a barometer to measure its height. Up here, Saussure got turned on by what he saw: bits of granite and shellfish fossils. Saussure reckoned if you found shellfish up a mountain, the ancient seabed must have risen to become mountains. Why? Because the mountains were made of granite, volcanic upheavals of molten granite way back. And since granite doesn't exactly wear down easily, then the present-day erosion you could see in granite rocks must have taken quite a while. And if that took a long time, how long had it taken to cause the erosion you see all around you on the mountains? So Saussure wrote a book saying, if erosion took the same amount of time in the ancient past as it did today, that meant the ancient past was really ancient. The Earth was incredibly old. Well, I don't have to tell you where that would lead. Saussure's ideas eventually got to Charles Darwin, who used the enormous age of the Earth to back his theory of evolution. Charles Darwin happened to have a cousin whose name was Francis Galton. Galton studied graveyards and death certificates and such, analysed the number of good family people who died over a period of time, as well as the number of imbeciles. The numbers were so meaningful as to suggest some kind of law. Heredity. So maybe top people could stay top people, and he meant ethnic groups and social classes as well as individuals, through, quote, selective parenthood, unquote. He gave all this stuff the name of eugenics. This code, thought up by Francis Galton at the turn of the 20th century, describes a different pattern everybody has. Some bits of the pattern are identified by a pair of letters, other bits are given a number. Take a look at one particular bit of detail, this number, 9. It's the number of times my pattern crosses a reference line from one feature in the pattern to another. In my case, the pattern crosses the reference line 9 times. So with Galton's code, you can identify my unique patterns in any one of these. My fingerprints. That's what Galton invented at the turn of the century. Fingerprinting. The story begins here, deep below London in 1940. Battle of Britain, British Air Defence Headquarters, England, France. Okay. We are here, the Germans are here. Or rather, here, here and here, coming across the channel towards us. No problem, radar stations here, here and here will spot them and save us all. But the radar aerials along the British coastline are so big, they're a very easy target. The answer? Cling wrap. Technical term, polythene. In all the wartime movies, it looks a piece of cake, doesn't it? Spot the enemy aircraft on your glowing radar screens, then guide the fighters to their targets. Tally-ho and all that. Except the easiest target for the enemy is big radar aerials. Small aerials are safer, but they make small signals that need special insulation. But what insulation? Polythene turned out to be great insulation. One of the ways you make polythene is by blowing bubbles of it when it's melted. Makes thin films like this. Just like soap bubbles like this. Interesting things, soap bubbles. A Scottish scientist once kept a soap bubble alive, so to speak, for 3 years. Of course, the Bible on soap was written at the beginning of the 19th century by a fellow who did most of his work in Paris, name of Chevreul. And Chevreul's contribution to the sum of total knowledge was that he found out why soap makes you clean. Meanwhile, why did he get into soap at all? Because he was really a dyer, and dyes interact with cloth fibers just like soap does. And Chevreul's obsession was to make intense colour dyes that wouldn't wash or fade out. Chevreul was director of dyeing at the Gobelin tapestry factory. These, as it happens, are the greatest tapestries of all time. 50 years before Chevreul, Gobelin tapestry design suddenly went very subtle, so the boss hired a couple of painters to design this kind of pattern. Subtle needlework, right? But you've probably already guessed you're not looking at a European design. And these Chinese figures are a clue to why the world-famous Gobelin factory didn't begin life as a tapestry factory at all. That's because in the early part of the 18th century, the hot stuff for doing up your house was anything from the Far East. Rugs, silks, porcelain, and the one thing the market turned up that was to turn out to be a real craze, and the reason the Gobelin factory was set up in the first place. Not to make tapestries at all, to make fake lacquer furniture. Real lacquerwork stuff from the Far East was turning up in Europe by 1610, but it was such a smash hit, prices went through the roof. Of course, it wasn't just furniture that cost a lot. A dealer could make 150% on pretty much anything he wanted to bring back from the Far East. And there was one particular bunch of Europeans who could never resist the opportunity to make that kind of profit. The Dutch. By the 17th century, Europe's #1 mail-order company. We will get you anything, they said, from anywhere, for the right price. 16th and 17th century Dutch traders were among the first to rendezvous out here in Southeast Asia, with the trading junks bringing cargoes of lacquered furniture and all kinds of other profitable goodies out of China. Unfortunately, right from the start, the Dutch had a small problem with actually getting to the rendezvous. Take a look at this map. We are here. Now at the time, there's only 2 ways to get here from Holland. This way, south and across the Pacific, and this way, south around Africa. This route is sewn up by the Portuguese, and this route by the Spanish. You try either way, and you got blown out of the water, which wasn't going to stop the Dutch. All the explorers and investors from the 6 main Dutch ports got together, set up a joint venture called the Dutch East India Company, and started looking at ways around this minor problem of how to get all that profit out east. And once they'd started really thinking about the problem, the solution appeared to be idiotically simple. If you couldn't go south, go north. You're smiling because you know what they didn't, because it wasn't on their maps, because they didn't know it existed. This. the polar ice pack. Still, ignorance is bliss. So, on April the 3rd, 1607, it was off out here to meet these junks for an English captain called Henry Hudson, that the Dutch had hired and, as it was to turn out, sent in the wrong direction. It was a map-making fellow called Planches who persuaded the Dutch East India Company to hire Hudson, and it was Planches who thought up the northerly route to China that got Hudson nowhere. Some of the earliest printed maps were published because of the 17th century printing empire of Christopher Plantin of Antwerp. The map that Henry Hudson used in searching for a northwest passage was made by one of Plantin's team of experts. That's one connection. Plantin's business had been given its first big boost when he was commissioned to produce 1,000 copies of a special new Bible. That's the other connection. In mid-16th century, Luther was persuading Catholics to go Protestant in droves. In 1565, after a top-level meeting, Rome decided, 1. Get the crowds back with music and decor like this. 2. Get people like Plantin to publish an unprecedented number of new standardized Bibles. 3. Start a Jesuit crackdown. 4. Discourage free-thinking with a list of prohibited books. One of the first books on that list was written by a Pole called Copernicus, who reckoned that the Earth wasn't the centre of the universe, which Rome said it was. Now, nobody took what Copernicus had said seriously until 1610, when here, just outside Florence, an Italian math professor called Galileo, living in the nearby village of Arcetri, published descriptions of what he'd seen the previous year when he'd looked up at the sky through an amazing Dutch gizmo. It was called a telescope. By the 17th century, telescopes had improved enough for you to get really good fixes on the stars. Trouble was, the star tables were based on the Earth being a perfect sphere. But if it wasn't, you could be miles away from where you thought you were. If the Earth were a perfect sphere, a 1-degree difference in a star fix would be seen from points on Earth, let me exaggerate to make the point, this far apart. And wherever you went on Earth, that distance would be the same. Well, in 1763, a bunch of French scientists took some extremely precise star fix measurements up in Lapland to check this out. And they discovered that the Earth was a flattened sphere, because up north, thanks to the accuracy with which they did their star fixes, at precisely the same time each night, they found the 1-degree difference here was a mile longer than down at the equator. They managed to do all that precision work because they had one of the latest measuring instruments with them, which took metalworking to new heights. This is the miracle machine, George Graham's clock. In the 1760s, George Graham came up with a new clock that was the most accurate ever built till then, because of the way Graham had shaped the pallet arms. That's one, moving in and out of the drive wheel teeth, see? Its special shape means it releases the wheel at a very precise moment. So, since the two pallet arms are rigidly fixed to the pendulum behind, the drive wheel is caught and released by one arm or the other with every swing of the pendulum. Well, that was fine, as long as the drive wheels worked okay, which they don't always, especially when they're here, at the top of a tower, where the clock can get covered in bat droppings, old grease, ice, snow, that kind of gunk, which everybody knew was going to be a problem with this particular clock. A lawyer called Grimshaw saved the day. Here's one of the pallet arms. Now, instead of being fixed to the pendulum like the Graham clock, it only touches it via those two horizontal rods bottom left. So that lets